Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. This time, we're tackling game level design. You know those moments in games where you're like, wait, how did they know I'd go that way?
Mhm.
Or those perfectly placed enemies that make you really work for the win?
I'm with you. It's that magic that keeps us hooked.
Exactly. And you know we love to go deep here, so we asked you to send in your burning level design
We
questions.
got a ton of great ones this time. But one thing that kept popping up, it was this book on level design, specifically in Unity.
Oh, yeah. I actually peeked at the excerpts some listeners sent over. And I gotta say, that book is structured in a really cool way.
Right. I really liked how it breaks things down,
It's like, first it lays out all the fundamentals of good level design. Like, no matter what kind of game you're making, these are the core principles.
which is so important because even if you're not building the next big RPG, those fundamentals, they really apply everywhere.
Really? Tell me more about that. I'm all about making those connections.
So at its heart, level design is about guiding someone through an experience. It could be a player through a game world, a user through a website.
Or even someone navigating a physical space, like a museum.
Exactly. It's about creating a journey that's engaging, logical, and making sure everything works in harmony to deliver that satisfying experience.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me, the book kept mentioning this idea of coherent design. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so coherent design, it's kind of like it sounds. It means that every single element in your game, the visuals, the sound, the mechanics, the stories, they all work together. It's about making sure there's a reason behind every single choice you make.
So it's not just about making things look pretty.
No, it's definitely not just about aesthetics, though good aesthetics can enhance a coherent design.
So it's more like a cohesive vision for the whole experience.
Exactly. It's about creating a world that feels believable, immersive. The book uses this game, Death's Door, as a prime example.
Oh, yeah. I love that game. The art style's amazing.
Yeah, and the art style is definitely part of it. But what makes Death's Door so successful in terms of coherent design is how its levels are all interconnected. They flow into each other seamlessly with all these secrets and shortcuts to discover.
It's like the world feels so much bigger than just the level you're playing.
And that's exactly what good level design should do. It should make the player feel like they're uncovering a world, not just completing a series of challenges.
Okay, I'm convinced. Coherent design is key. But now, let's talk about the players themselves.
You mean, who are we building all of this for?
Exactly, because I imagine designing a game for someone who loves solving puzzles is totally different from designing for someone who wants to blow stuff up.
You are 100% right. And thankfully, there's a framework for understanding those different player motivations.
Ooh, lay it on me.
So the book dives into this thing called Bartle's taxonomy. Have you heard of it?
It rings a bell, but a little refresher never hurts.
Okay, so basically, Bartle's taxonomy breaks down players into four main types: achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers. And each type is motivated by different things.
Okay, this is already fascinating. So tell me, what makes each of these player types tick?
Let's start with achievers. Those are the players who are all about conquering challenges, earning rewards, topping those leaderboards. They thrive on progression and mastery.
I can see that. Always got to hit that next level. What about explorers? I feel like that might be me.
Explorers are driven by curiosity. They want to see everything the game world has to offer, uncover every secret, find every hidden nook and cranny.
Okay, yeah, that's totally me. Give me a sprawling map to explore any day.
Laughs, right? And then we have socializers. They're all about connecting with other players. For them, it's about the shared experience, the community.
That makes sense. Some of my favorite gaming memories are from those big MMO raids with friends.
And lastly, we have the killers.
Killers, that sounds kind of intense.
Laughs. Don't worry, it's not as literal as it sounds. It's more about the thrill of competition, of outsmarting and, yeah, sometimes dominating other players.
Okay, so more about strategy and skill than, actual virtual homicide.
Precisely.
So, knowing all of this, how does a game designer actually use this taxonomy? Do they just pick one type and go all in?
That's a great question. And actually, the book makes a really interesting point. It says that the most successful games, they usually don't try to cater to every single player type equally.
That's surprising. I would have thought appealing to everyone would be the goal.
It makes sense when you think about it, though. Like, trying to be everything to everyone often means you end up being nothing to anyone. It's about focus.
So it's about identifying your core audience, the type of player you want to resonate with the most, and then crafting the experience for them.
Exactly. And that's a valuable lesson for anything, right? Whether you're
Yeah.
designing a game, building a product, even just figuring out your own career path.
Okay, so we've talked about the why of level design, the who we're designing for, but how do we actually do it? Like, how do we go from this blank canvas to, like, an actual level someone's going to play?
Right. It is kind of like having this big box of Lego bricks, and you got to figure out what to build.
Yeah.
But thankfully, there are tools and techniques that level designers use.
Okay, so what's step one? Where do we even start?
Well, the book talks about this concept of metrics, and it's basically all about measurements and relationships within the game world. Like, how big is your character compared to the environment? How far can they jump?
How fast can they run?
Exactly. All of those things factor into how the player experiences the game.
So it's not just about placing walls and obstacles willy-nilly. It's about being really intentional with every single element.
Precisely. It's like designing a room. You wouldn't just throw furniture in there randomly. You'd think about how people are going to move through that space, how they're going to interact with it. Games are the same way.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And it makes it sound like level design involves a bit of math.
Well, there's definitely some spatial reasoning involved. But don't worry, you don't need to be a mathematician to be a great level designer.
That's a relief to hear. So we've got our metrics figured out. What's next? How do we guide the player without making them feel like they're being led around by the nose?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Nobody likes to feel railroaded in a game.
Right. It's all about that balance of freedom and guidance.
Exactly. And one of the key concepts here is something called line of sight. Basically, it's about understanding how the player's eye naturally moves through a space. What are they going to be drawn to first?
It's like when you walk into a room and your eye immediately goes to the window or a piece of art on the wall.
Exactly. Our eyes are naturally drawn to points of interest, to contrasts in light and shadow, to movement. And level designers can use that to their advantage.
So you're saying they can use these visual cues to subtly guide the player's attention.
Precisely. Like imagine you're walking down a dark hallway and there's a single light at the end. You're naturally going to be drawn towards that light, right?
Yeah, it creates a path, even if it's not an explicit one.
And the cool thing is, it doesn't have to be that literal. It could be a landmark in the distance or a trail of breadcrumbs, or
Or even like an enemy patrol that the player naturally wants to avoid.
there you go. You're getting it. It's all about those subtle cues that guide the player without them even realizing they're being guided.
It's like whispering, hey, over here, but not too loud, instead of shouting, go this way.
Yes. And you know what else plays into all of this? Blind spots. Those areas in a level that are hidden from view.
Ooh, so you can use those to hide secrets or set up ambushes.
See? You've got the mind for this. Blind spots can be used to create tension, build anticipation, or even just to give the player a little breathing room.
It's like the difference between a wide open field and a dense forest. One makes you feel exposed, while the other feels full of possibilities, and maybe a few lurking dangers.
Exactly. It's all about using the environment to create the desired emotional response in the player.
This is making me think about all those times I felt completely lost in a game, and not in a good way.
Right. And that's the last thing you want as a designer. You want the player to feel challenged, but not frustrated.
So, how do we walk that tightrope? How do we make sure players are engaged without feeling overwhelmed?
One of the most important things is how we teach the player about the game's mechanics. We've talked about guiding them through the environment, but what about guiding their understanding of how the game itself works?
Right, because I've definitely played games where I was just bombarded with tutorials and instructions, and it felt overwhelming.
Oh, tell me about it. It can feel like information overload. That's why a lot of designers use this thing called the rule of three.
The rule of three, tell me more.
So, essentially, the rule of three suggests that you introduce a new concept or mechanic to the player 3 times, each time building upon the previous introduction.
So it's about repetition and reinforcement.
Exactly. The first time, it's a basic introduction. The second time, maybe you add a little more complexity, and by the third time, the player should have a solid grasp of the concept.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you have an example of how this might work in a game?
Sure.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a game where the player can double jump to reach higher platforms.
Okay, so pretty standard platformer stuff.
Right. So the first time you introduce the double jump, you might put a platform just barely out of reach of a saddle jump. The player tries to reach it, fails, and then boom, they discover the double jump.
I'm with you. So they learn by doing, which is always more engaging than just being told.
Exactly. Then the second time, you might put the platform a bit further away, so they have to double jump to reach it. And maybe you add some kind of visual cue, like a glowing platform or something, to subtly remind them.
Okay, so now they're starting to see the practical applications of the double jump.
You got it. And then the third time, you really challenge them. Maybe they have to double jump over a chasm or past a series of obstacles.
So by that point, the double jump is second nature. It's just part of their toolkit.
Exactly. They've learned it, they've practiced it, and now they can use it without even thinking about it.
It's like learning to ride a bike.
That's a great analogy. It's about turning those conscious actions into unconscious competence.
So once we've established these rules and mechanics, what's next? How do we keep things fresh and engaging for the player?
That's where things get really interesting. Because once you've established a pattern, you can start to play with it. You can subvert expectations.
Ooh, I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
So let's say the player has mastered the double jump. Now, you introduce a platform that's just a little too high for a double jump to reach. The player tries it once, twice.
And they're thinking, wait a minute, this isn't how it's supposed to work.
Exactly. And that's when you introduce a new mechanic, maybe a triple jump or a wall jump or something completely unexpected.
So you're breaking the rules you just taught them.
In a way, yes. But it's about keeping the player on their toes, challenging their assumptions, and making the game world feel more dynamic and surprising.
It's like those magic tricks where you think you know how it's done and then bam, the magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat.
I love that analogy. It's that same feeling of wonder and delight.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about metrics, line of sight, blind spots, the rule of three, subverting expectations. But there's one big elephant in the room we haven't addressed yet.
And what's that?
Procedural level design. It's mentioned a bunch in the book, and it sounds kind of intimidating.
Ah, yes. Procedural generation. It's definitely a hot topic in game design these days.
So what is it exactly in like layman's terms?
So basically, procedural generation is all about using algorithms to create game content, like levels, environments, even quests, instead of handcrafting every single detail.
So it's like the computer's doing some of the heavy lifting for the designers.
Exactly. It's like giving the computer a set of rules and some building blocks, and then letting it loose to create something awesome.
That sounds amazing, but also a little scary.
Yeah, I get that. There's definitely a learning curve.
So what are the benefits of using procedural generation?
Well, for one, it can save designers a ton of time. Instead of spending hours placing every tree and rock by hand, they can create algorithms that generate those elements procedurally.
So it frees them up to focus on the bigger picture stuff.
Exactly. Plus, it can lead to incredibly vast and varied game worlds. Like, think about games like Minecraft or No Man's Sky.
Those are great examples. I can't even imagine how long it would take to handcraft those worlds.
Exactly. It would be practically impossible. And even if it were possible, it wouldn't have that same sense of scope and grandeur.
So procedural generation is all about creating those massive, sprawling worlds that feel truly unique.
That's a big part of it. But it's not just about size and scale. It's also about creating a sense of unpredictability and replayability.
Because you never know exactly what the game is going to throw at you next.
Exactly. And that can lead to some really cool emergent gameplay moments.
Procedural generation. It's like this whole other level of game design wizardry. But you know what's been really cool to hear about?
What's that?
It's how, even with all these amazing tools and technology, it still comes down to human creativity.
It's true. You can have the most powerful algorithms in the world, but without that human touch, without that spark of artistry, it's just
ones and zeros.
pretty much. It takes a human to think like a player, to anticipate their reactions, to craft those moments of surprise and delight.
And that makes me think about how, even in our everyday lives, we're surrounded by good design and bad design.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I was just thinking about my morning commute. The train station I go through, it's so well designed, everything just flows.
And then there are those places.
Oh, don't even get me started. Like, you know that feeling when you walk into a store and you just get completely turned around?
It's like they designed it to be intentionally confusing.
Exactly. And it's amazing how much of a difference good design makes. It can really impact how we feel, how we experience the world around us.
It's true. And it's not just about aesthetics. It's about functionality, about flow, about understanding how people interact with their environment.
It's like that saying, form follows function. But in this case, it's like good design follows good understanding.
I like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great note to end on.
I do too. We've covered so much ground today, from the psychology of players to the algorithms behind procedural generation, but ultimately it all comes back to this. Good level design is about creating experiences that resonate with people, that make them feel something.
Well said.
So, to all you aspiring game designers out there and start creating. And to everyone else, keep an eye out for those moments of brilliance in the games you play, the websites you visit, the spaces you inhabit. You might be surprised by what you discover.
I couldn't agree more.
And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of game level design. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.